Welcome back. In a moment, we'll examine global free trade deals. But first, here are some other stories to keep an eye on. Over 100 people have been killed following heavy snow and avalanches that hit Afghanistan and neighbouring regions over the weekend. Deadly avalanches are frequent in the mountainous north, and officials warn of more snowstorms to come. Rescue workers are still battling to reach survivors. Mass rallies continue throughout Romania following the government's step back from a controversial law that decriminalised corruption of offences. An estimated 500,000 protesters rallied together in Romania's capital, Bucharest, as week-long protests continue. And the Queen of England's become the first British monarch to reach a Sapphire Jubilee. That marks 65 years on the throne. A 41-gun salute was fired in her honour, with further celebrations taking place throughout the day. A portrait of Queen Elizabeth II by the British photographer David Bailey has been reissued to mark the occasion. Well, President Trump may be vocally against international trade deals, but free trade agreements are common around the world, and their advocates argue they bring net benefits to citizens. The Mercosur trade agreement connects 5 South American countries and 6 other associate countries. The trading bloc has been largely successful, but increased protectionism and rule-breaking have threatened the Union. Venezuela was suspended from the bloc in 2016. NAFTA has been a controversial subject in recent years. Donald Trump built much of his campaign support by criticising the deal, signed in 1993 by the then President Bill Clinton.
NAFTA's been a catastrophe for our country. It's been a catastrophe for our workers and our jobs and our companies. They're leaving our country. I want to change it.
And the European Union, the world's largest single market. 28 member states allow free movement of people, goods, services and capital. The estimated population of the bloc is 510 million. But across the continent, political parties opposed to membership are on the rise. The United Kingdom, for instance, voted to leave the Union in June of 2016.
2016 has been the year of political revolution. It's been the year of the outsiders. But remember, what made Brexit happen and what got Trump elected were a lot of little people who don't normally vote at all, but have simply had enough and want to vote for change.
Some of the largest free trade areas are yet to be realised. The proposed continental free trade area would see all 54 African states establish a free trade zone that would eclipse the EU as the world's largest. It would become a market of more than 1 billion people with a GDP of more than $3 trillion. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, is a proposed free trade agreement that will formally combine the ASEAN trading bloc with its associate countries. Thought of by many as an alternative to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the prospective member states would account for 3.4 billion people and approximately 30% of the world's GDP. Well, to discuss that further, I'm joined now by Nick Dearden, who is the director of the campaigning charity Global Justice Now, and still with us, David Collins, Professor of International Economic Law at City, University of London. Nick Dearden, the proposal that free trade or trade deals are better than no deals at all, do you at least agree with that?
It all depends how it's done. I mean, we're not against trade necessarily, but it depends how the trade deals are actually agreed. And one of the problems with the new generation of trade deals, like TTIP and TPP, is it's really moving away from talking about tariffs and quotas and those kind of old-fashioned issues, and talking far more about regulations and standardizing regulations. And very much, in particular, we're concerned about the inclusion of more and more investor protection. So to protect foreign corporations that are investing or trading with a certain country.
If they also protect workers' rights and they protect the environment, aren't they a good thing?
Well, that would be very good if they protected the environment and workers' rights. But we often find that the language used around workers' rights and the environment is far inferior to the language used and the mechanisms that can be used to protect corporate interests, and that's our worry.
You were saying the opposite there, Nick.
Well, I'm not sure. I certainly agree with Nick in as much as I think the age of negotiating tariffs and quotas is over, because I think there were major successes in those areas. Certainly the trade agreements are looking closer at regulation, but certainly the TTIP was more about eliminating redundant regulations, sort of regulations that have been duplicated on both sides of the Atlantic. And with respect to investor protection, I think the TTP, certainly the CETA, the new agreement between Canada and the EU, would have had a much greater protection for citizens while enshrining the investor protection mechanism for this new investment court system with a two-layered system that was much more transparent than these mechanisms had been in the past.
I can't quite see how everybody wins, though. If somebody wins, if there's an advantage to one side, surely there's a disadvantage to another.
Well, it's not necessarily a zero-sum game. So trade can benefit both sides. But I think what we've seen in recent years, because so many trade agreements are of the view that you simply leave things to the market, you leave things to big business and everything will be okay, and an inability of workers and campaigners and activists and environmentalists and whatever to protect their own interests, what you've seen is a huge imbalance in the way that trade agreements are negotiated. And so very often it isn't even that the United States will gain and Europe will lose, but certain segments of those societies will gain and other segments of those societies will lose. And very, very often it's the richest and wealthiest that gain and ordinary workers.
And those suspicions, David, are fueled by the secrecy that surrounds this. Nobody seems to understand what's going on. Why is it so secret?
Well, the consultations on the TTIP, the public consultations on the TTIP were massive. The stakeholder engagement was off the scale in the EU for TTIP. And I think that's probably in large part why we're talking about these agreements more now than we did 20 years ago. So I think in that respect, there's been major improvement. The problem with excessive public engagement is you sometimes end up having these myths created and this perpetuation of ignorance because, as was pointed out in your spot earlier, they're very, very technically complex, and you can't expect people to understand the nuances of negotiating things like health regulations and so on for various types of products.
I mean, the concern about some of the transatlantic ones, there are scare stories, Nick, that emerge from this. Certain kinds of chicken that the Germans don't like and the Americans produce en masse. Could American companies come in and somehow take over large swathes of the British health system? Are they just that? They're scare stories. They come out of ignorance.
Well, we don't believe they are. So, I mean, the interest in this country around the National Health Service and whether TTIP posed a threat to the National Health Service was certainly backed up by legal opinions from trade unions like Unite, that even though it wasn't necessarily covered in every aspect of the trade agreement, that under investor protection, decisions by the government which are made in the public interest but which corporations perceive to be damaging to their interest are opened for court challenge, open for legal challenge. In these special arbitration systems that ordinary members of the public don't have access to. And I think that everybody would see that a legal system that you don't have equal access to, that only one section of society, and it just so happens that it's the one of the wealthiest and most powerful sections of society have access to, yet ordinary people who are affected by these trade agreements don't. That's not fair.
Don't we entrust our political leaders to do that in all sorts of walks of life?
Well, I think that the court system, for example, can challenge political leaders. You know, it means that we have the ability to ensure that political leaders don't trample all over our rights or all over our constitution. Now, nobody's saying that business doesn't have the right to pursue similar cases, but they can do so in the same way that you and I can do so, i.e. going through our domestic court system. I think the idea of creating a special legal mechanism for those who are already incredibly powerful in the globalized world of economics is really dangerous and damaging. And for most people who see that their rights over the years have often been detrimentally impacted by trade agreements, that sows a lot of suspicion in their minds.
What do you think, David, is going to happen in terms of this, the Trump effect, if you like, around the world? If there's a lot of dismantling of all the American-centric deals, does it necessarily follow that other things like the African deal we mentioned, like Australasia and so on, will they fall apart too?
Well, I think the answer to that is probably a political one. If politicians around the world think that there's capital in turning their backs from globalization, turning their backs from trade agreements, then yes, it may well ripple around the world. But I think,
what would be the consequences of that in your view?
I think it would be a massive decline in GDP, possibly a global recession, increase in poverty. I think the effects could be quite seriously bad.
So better the devil we know? Do you think?
I would say actually they're two sides of the same coin. I would say Trump and Brexit are products of a trade system which has not looked enough to the interests of people at the bottom of our own societies, and they've created and fueled this. We share nothing in common with Donald Trump because I don't think he's against trade or corporate interests. He just wants to grab more on behalf of America vis-a-vis other countries than multilateral deals. There's lots of problems with TPP and TTIP, but their multilateralism isn't one of them. We need a rule-based system for trade, but that rules-based system needs to put ordinary people back at the center of the economy, not just the interests of big business.
And the other big slab of the world economy that is very much looking to itself is Europe, with the Brexit effect still unknown, and with the French elections coming round, and prospects perhaps France might have a leader that would take France out of the European Economic Area, if not the Union, and all this kind of stuff. We're in for a disruptive period, don't you think, David?
It would seem like it, yes, and I think the multilateral era seems to be drawing to a close. Whether that means there'll be more bilateral agreements or not, we'll see. It would seem as though Trump is very much interested in pursuing bilateral arrangements. The UK certainly is, so there will be more trade agreements. But I think the era of the mega regional that we talked about so much a year or two ago may have dawned to an end. And then the next question is, what about the World Trade Organization? I mean, the U.S. is well entrenched in the World Trade Organization. I would like to think that the World Trade Organization will remain healthy, but we'll see. Certainly there hasn't been much progress lately in the last 10 years or so, other than the Trade Facilitation Agreement. But certainly, yes, I would say a disruptive period seems to be on its way.
World Trade Organization, still some life in that yet?
Possibly, but I think the World Trade Organization needs to seriously re-examine some of its rules, which promotes as a absolute truth the idea that markets know best, that liberalization and privatization always work better for people in the public sector. It needs to re-examine that if we're to be able to confront what Trump is trying to do. And Trump's policies are the very beggar my neighbor policies that fueled the Second World War and the First World War to some degree. They're very dangerous, and if we want to beat and undercut them, we have to show people that trade can work in a different way, and it can work in a way that benefits ordinary people.
Nick Dearden, David Collins, thank you both very much indeed. Now, we end with our Insight Bite, a little something that we feel you should know. And today we're heading to Japan, where the annual Sapporo Snow Festival has kicked off. Marking its 68th event this year, the festival features more than 200 ice sculptures of iconic locations, movie characters, and global celebrities. The festival is open for a week and hopes to entertain an estimated 2 million visitors during that time. Some of the biggest sculptures at this year's festival honour various Star Wars characters to commemorate the 40th anniversary of that movie release. So if you're a fan of snow and the stars, Japan's Sapporo Festival seems the perfect escape into fantasy. And that's all from me for now. I'm Martin Stanford. That was Insight.